Hello, everybody. Welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why, and how of newspaper reading. Today, we shall be analyzing the Hindu newspaper dated 7th of Feb 2019 of the New Delhi edition. The topics to be discussed today has been presented on your screen. Timestamping for the same has been provided in the description box below. Let us begin our today's discussion. Now, this particular article appears on page number 9. The title of the article is We Need a Leap in the Healthcare Spending. This article shall be important from the perspective of GS Paper 3, Economy, under the subsection Indian Economy and Various Issues. Before analyzing this particular article, let us first look into its background. If you look at the relationship between the economic growth of a country and its health outcomes, increase in the economic growth may not necessarily lead to an increase in the health outcomes. On the other hand, increase in the health outcomes usually leads to the economic growth. This is because as the health outcomes in a country improves, the productivity of the workers improves, and this leads to a growth in the economy. This particular facet of the relationship between economic growth and health outcomes can be seen in case of India. So if you look at the growth of the Indian economy, India is considered to be the sixth largest economy in the world, and it is said to become the fifth largest economy by the end of this particular financial year. However, this increase in the GDP growth has not been accompanied by the increase in the health outcomes. For example, due to the poor health indicators, India has struggled to meet Millennium Development Goals. Apart from that, India may find it difficult to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. This is on account of poor health indicators such as the infant mortality rate, the maternal mortality rate, access to safe drinking water, and sanitation. Apart from these poor health indicators, India is also facing a dual burden of both communicable diseases as well as the non-communicable diseases. Further, if you look at India's ranking on the Global Hunger Index report, India's ranking is comparable to some of the sub-Saharan countries. So looking at these particular arguments, we can conclude that the increase in the GDP growth rate of India has not translated into the better health outcomes. Hence, in this regard, this particular article here highlights that India has to increase its expenditure on health. Such an increase in the healthcare expenditure would not only lead to improvement in the health outcomes, but it would also promote the economic growth. Further, based upon this particular article, an expected UPSC mains question could be the rapid economic growth in India has not translated into the better health outcomes due to the lower public expenditure on health. Discuss. Hence, as part of this particular video analysis, let us understand various problems with respect to the public healthcare expenditure in India. The first main problem with respect to the healthcare expenditure in India is that India spends very less amount of money on the healthcare related expenditure. For example, recently the Central Bureau of Health Intelligence had released a report known as the National Health Profile 2018. Now, this particular report stated that India is spending only around 1.02% of its GDP on health, and this expenditure is considered to be lowest among all the countries. For example, the World Bank divides the various countries across the world into different income groups, and such a categorization is based upon the per capita income. And you can see here, these categories are the high income countries, the upper middle income countries, the lower middle income countries, and the lower income countries. And presently, according to the per capita income, India has been categorized as the lower middle income countries. So if you look at the expenditure of the lower middle income countries on health, it is approximately around 2.5% of their GDP. On the other hand, if you look at India's expenditure on health, it is only around 1%. And one important point which has to be noted here is that in spite of India being categorized as a lower middle income country, India's expenditure on health is much lower as compared to the lower income countries. Apart from that, some of the countries in our neighborhood are spending more amount of money than India on healthcare related expenditure. For example, Bhutan is spending around 2.5% of its GDP. Sri Lanka is spending around 1.6%. Even Nepal has been spending a higher amount of its expenditure on health than India. Apart from lower public health expenditure as percentage of GDP, even the per capita health expenditure in India is considered to be quite poor. For example, India's per capita expenditure on health is around $16. However, Sri Lanka is spending 4 times higher amount of money on health than India. And the same can be said about even Bhutan as well. So, looking at all these facts and figures, it can be concluded that India's expenditure on health is considered to be lowest among all countries, and it is much lower than the low income countries as well. Now, all these facts and figures do not become important from the exam perspective. However, when you're writing an answer in the mains, you can highlight the fact that, in spite of India being categorized as a lower middle income country, India's expenditure on health is much lower than the low income countries. You can also highlight the fact that the per capita expenditure of some of the countries, such as Bhutan or Sri Lanka, is almost 4 times that of India. Further, in the interim budget for the year 2019-20, the Government of India has announced schemes and programs for the benefit of the poor and vulnerable sections in India. For example, for the benefit of small and marginal farmers, the Government of India has announced the PM Kisan scheme. Similarly, since India is spending less amount of money on the healthcare related expenditure, it was expected that the budget allocation for the health would increase. So, if you look at the budget allocation for the health in the interim budget for the year 2019-20, there has been absolute increase in the allocation for health by almost 7,000 crores, and this is for the Ayushman Bharat scheme. However, if you look at government's expenditure as a percentage of budget, this has remained same as compared to the year 2018-19, wherein in both the financial years the government has been spending only 2.2% of the budget on the health related expenditure, which clearly shows that there has been no net increase in the budget allocation for the health related expenditure. Further, as you know, the Ayushman Bharat scheme has mainly two components, wherein the first component is the National Health Protection Scheme, which provides for an insurance coverage of rupees 5 lakh per year for undertaking the secondary and tertiary treatment. And the second component of the Ayushman Bharat scheme is the health and wellness centers. Now, the health and wellness centers are considered to be foundation of the India's healthcare system, wherein the government of India seeks to provide for a comprehensive health coverage to the people through the setting up of the health and wellness centers, wherein these health and wellness centers are set to focus on the preventive care. The government of India has sought to set up almost 1.5 lakh health and wellness centers across India, and setting up of these health and wellness centers would bring about a paradigm shift in the healthcare from managing illness to promoting wellness. This is because the health and wellness centers would predominantly focus on prevention of various diseases, such as both communicable as well as the non-communicable diseases. Apart from that, the health and wellness centers would also provide for free essential drugs or medicines as well as the diagnostic services. So you can clearly see here the scope of health facilities which would be offered by the health and wellness centers is quite broader. However, if you look at the amount of money which has been allocated for setting up of health and wellness centers, it comes down to around rupees 1 lakh for every health and wellness centers in India, and such an amount is considered to be quite meager since the health and wellness centers are said to provide a holistic and comprehensive healthcare to the people. Hence, this lower expenditure on setting up of health and wellness centers would mean that the government would not be able to focus on providing preventive healthcare facilities to the people. Lastly, in the recent times, India has also seen a drastic increase in lifestyle related diseases such as diabetes, cardiovascular diseases, kidney ailments, cancer, etc. However, in spite of the increase in the non communicable diseases, the screening and diagnostic facilities in India continue to remain poor. This is evident in the fact that almost 70% of the cancer related cases are diagnosed in the third stage or the fourth stage, and such a late diagnosis of cancer leads to lower cure rate and a higher death rate of the patients. Hence, accordingly, India has to spend a higher amount of money on the screening and diagnostic facilities for the non communicable diseases. So, these are some of the important aspects which one must know with respect to this particular article. Further, based upon our video analysis, you can try writing answer to this expected UPSC mains question. With this, let us now move to the next article. This particular article appears on page number 9. The title of the article is A Worrying Approach. This article shall be important from the perspective of GS Paper 2 Governance under the subsection Issues and Challenges pertaining to the federal structure, as well as devolution of powers and finances from the center to the states. Recently, the central government had launched the Ayushman Bharat scheme. As you know, this particular scheme seeks to provide a health insurance coverage of up to rupees 5 lakhs for undertaking the secondary and tertiary treatment. However, this particular article here highlights that the implementation of this particular scheme has hit roadblocks. This is because some of the states such as West Bengal, Telangana, Delhi and Odisha have decided to opt out of the Ayushman Bharat scheme. Hence, in this regard, this particular article seeks to analyze whether the Ayushman Bharat scheme hurts the spirit of cooperative federalism. Hence, as part of this video analysis, let us understand as to why the design of the Ayushman Bharat scheme goes against the spirit of the cooperative federalism. Cooperative federalism can be considered to be a form of federalism in which the center and states come together in order to solve the common problems. Now, cooperative federalism is considered to be quite important for a country like India. This is because if India has to solve its problems of poverty, unemployment, education, or health, then the nature of interaction between the center and state has to be guided by the spirit of cooperative federalism, which means to say that the central government has to take into account the interests of the state government. Similarly, the state governments have to take into account the interests of the union government in order to solve the common problems. However, this particular article here highlights that the Ayushman Bharat scheme would violate the spirit of the cooperative federalism between the union and the states. In this regard, let us understand the argument put forward in this particular article. As you all know, the Ayushman Bharat scheme is a centrally sponsored scheme wherein the central government provides for the 60% of the funds, whereas the remaining 40% of the funds are provided by the state governments. What is important to be noted here is that even though the funds are provided by both center and states, the implementation of the scheme lies with the state governments. This is because public health is part of the state list under the 7th schedule of the Indian Constitution. So for the Ayushman Bharat scheme, the funds would be provided by both center as well as states. However, the implementation of this particular scheme would be the responsibility of the state governments. Now, this particular article here has highlighted certain concerns with respect to the design of the Ayushman Bharat scheme. Now, the Ayushman Bharat scheme was launched in the year 2018. Now, even before the launch of the Ayushman Bharat scheme, some of the states in India were implementing similar schemes in order to provide for the health insurance coverage to its citizens. For example, the government of West Bengal was implementing the Swasthya Sathi scheme. Similarly, the Telangana government was implementing the Arogya Shri scheme. Now, these schemes were entirely funded as well as implemented by the concerned state governments. Now, what has happened here is that after the launch of the Ayushman Bharat scheme, all the states in India are required to earmark 40% of the funds for the implementation of the Ayushman Bharat scheme. Now, some states in India, such as West Bengal and Telangana, are against the implementation of Ayushman Bharat scheme, since the Ayushman Bharat scheme would be in addition to their own state schemes, and this would lead to confusion as well as administrative challenges. And more importantly, if the states are required to provide for 40% of the funds for the Ayushman Bharat scheme, then it would mean that the state governments would have to reduce their expenditure on their own state schemes. On account of this particular reason, some of the states such as West Bengal, Telangana, Delhi as well as Odisha have decided to opt out of the Ayushman Bharat scheme. Further, the central government has stated that all the states in India have to compulsorily prefix the name Ayushman Bharat to their existing state schemes. For example, the Telangana government is implementing the Arogya Shri scheme, and in order to implement the Ayushman Bharat scheme, this particular scheme has to be renamed as Ayushman Bharat Arogya Shri scheme. Now, some of the states in India are against renaming of these schemes because of political compulsions. Hence, because of these two reasons, some of the states have decided to opt out of the Ayushman Bharat scheme. Now, in a federal structure such as India, the transfer of funds from the center to the states take place in mainly two manners. One is the transfer of tied grants, and the second one is the transfer of the untied grants. Now, untied grants essentially means when the central government transfers funds to the state government, it does not impose any conditions on the usage of funds by the concerned state governments. Which means that in case of untied grants, the state governments have complete freedom or flexibility with respect to the purpose for which the funds have to be utilized for. For example, based upon the recommendations of the Finance Commission, the central government transfer the taxes to the state governments. Now, the taxes which are got transferred to the state governments are considered to be the untied grants since there are no conditions attached with respect to the usage of the funds. Hence, a transfer of untied grants from the center to the states gives more amount of financial autonomy to the states. And using the untied grants, the state governments can design schemes and programs which would be capable of accommodating the local requirements. However, if you look at the tied grants, whenever the central government transfers the money to the state government, the central government imposes certain conditions with respect to the usage of the funds. For example, when the central government transfers money for the centrally sponsored schemes, usually the central government imposes certain conditions on the states with respect to usage of the money which is allocated for the centrally sponsored schemes. Now, such a design of the centrally sponsored schemes lead to lack of flexibility on the states for the implementation of the schemes. Hence, looking at the concept of tied and untied grants, we can conclude that in order to promote the spirit of cooperative federalism, the central government has to provide for more amount of untied grants. This is because the untied grants would lead to financial autonomy to the states, and the state governments would be able to design the programs keeping in mind the ground realities. However, if the central government provides for transfer of tied grants, then the states would not be able to accommodate the local requirements due to lack of flexibility. Now, what has happened under the Ayushman Bharat scheme is that since this particular scheme is a centrally sponsored scheme, the states do not have flexibility to design the programs according to their ground level requirements. Now, this becomes extremely important because not all the states in India are facing similar health related problems. For example, developed states such as Kerala and Tamil Nadu may be facing the problems of the lifestyle related diseases. On the other hand, some of the poor and underdeveloped states may be facing the problem of the communicable diseases. Hence, in this regard, we need to give sufficient amount of flexibility to the states for the implementation of the health related schemes. And such a flexibility would ensure that the state governments would be able to take into account the ground realities for the implementation of the scheme. Now, these are some of the important aspects which one must know with respect to this particular article. Further, whatever problems which we have discussed with respect to transfer of funds under the Ayushman Bharat scheme can also be extended to the other centrally sponsored scheme. Hence, so if you come across any question with respect to problems of the centrally sponsored schemes, you can highlight the fact that since the centrally sponsored schemes provide for tied grants, you can highlight the fact that it leads to lack of flexibility and does not sufficiently empower the states. With this, let us now move to the next article. Now, the next article appears on page number 9. The title of the article is Pension for the Informal Sector Workers. This article shall be important from the perspective of GS Paper 3 Economy under the subsection Indian Economy and Various Issues. As you all are aware, in the Interim Budget 2019-20, the Government of India has announced a new scheme known as the Pradhan Shram Yogi Mandhan scheme. This particular scheme seeks to provide for pension for the unorganized workers whose monthly income is up to Rs 15,000. Under this particular scheme, these workers shall be provided with a pension amount of Rs 3,000 per month from the age of 60. However, in order to avail pension, the workers of the unorganized sector would be required to contribute to the pension fund. And based upon the contribution of the workers, the central government would be making equal amount of contribution. The contribution of the central government to the workers shall be fixed in such a manner so as to ensure that the workers would be able to get Rs 3,000 per month from the age of 60 as pension. Now, we have discussed all the details related to the Pradhan Shram Yogi Mandhan in our DNS video on the interim budget on 2nd of Feb 2019. So for those of you who would want to know details about this particular scheme, I would request you to go through this particular DNS dated 2nd of Feb 2019. Now, this particular article here highlights that the implementation of Pradhan Shram Yogi Mandhan scheme would face multiple challenges. Hence, accordingly, based upon this particular article, an expected UPSC mains question could be the announcement of Pradhan Shram Yogi Mandhan scheme for the benefit of unorganized workers is a step in the right direction. However, the implementation of this particular scheme would face multifaceted challenges. Analyze. Hence, as part of this video analysis, let us understand various implementation challenges of the Pradhan Shram Yogi Mandhan scheme. Now, this particular article here has mainly highlighted 3 challenges with respect to the implementation of the Pradhan Shram Yogi Mandhan scheme. The first problem is with respect to the government allocation for this particular scheme. Now, this particular article has highlighted that the government has allocated only 500 crores rupees for the implementation of this particular scheme, which is considered to be quite marginal. And this particular amount is considered to be quite less since the government intends to provide pension to almost 10 crore people who are employed in the unorganized sector. Further, the Government of India is implementing a scheme known as the National Social Assistance Program. Now, under this particular program, the government is providing pension amount to the senior citizens, disabled, as well as widows. Now, based upon the analysis of the budget documents, this particular article has highlighted that the government has allocated money for the Pradhan Mantri Shram Yogi Mandhan scheme by cutting down its expenditure on the National Social Assistance Program. Hence, such a cut in this National Social Assistance Program would go against the interest of the senior citizens, differently abled, as well as widows. The second problem highlighted in the article is with respect to voluntary contribution of the workers in the unorganized sector, wherein this article highlights that it would be difficult to implement the voluntary contribution of the workers. This is because the workers in the unorganized sector earn less amount of salary. And secondly, the workers in the unorganized sector face a higher burden of indirect taxes such as the GST. So what the article highlights is that since the workers in the unorganized sector earn less amount of salary and also pay indirect taxes such as the GST, they may not be in a position to voluntarily contribute for the pension. And lastly, there has been certain confusion and ambiguity with respect to implementation of the scheme. This is because the government has been silent on number of aspects with respect to implementation of this scheme. For example, the government has not stated as to what would happen if an informal worker misses his contribution to the pension fund. Or for that matter, what would happen if an informal worker becomes a formal worker? For example, let's say a person A is working in an unorganized sector and he makes a contribution to the pension fund for almost 2 years. And after 2 years, he stops making contribution to the pension fund. So the question here is what would happen to this particular money which has been contributed by the person A? That is, whether the money would be returned back to the person or whether the money will be entirely forfeited by the government. The second confusion is that if this particular person A, who was earlier an informal worker and has contributed to the pension fund, and later this particular person A gets a government job, which means that he has turned from an informal worker to a formal worker. So, under such circumstances, the government has not clarified as to what would happen to the money which has been contributed by this particular person before he became a formal worker. So, since the government has been silent on these aspects of the Pradhan Mantri Shram Yogi Mandhan scheme, there has been confusion among the informal workers. So, these are some of the important aspects which one must know with respect to this particular article. With this, let us now move to the next article. Now, this particular article appears as an editorial on page number 8. The title of the article is Tough Talking. As you must be aware, both Russia as well as US are presently in negotiations with Taliban, and the Taliban reconciliation process is moving at a faster pace than what was anticipated earlier. Hence, in this regard, this particular article here highlights that India must ensure that it is not left out of the reconciliation process. This article shall be important from the perspective of GS Paper 2, International Relations, under the subsection India and its Neighborhood. Both US as well as Russia have been engaged in direct talks with Taliban. Now, even though both of these are rival processes, they are similar in approach. For example, Russia is facilitating direct talks between the mainstream Afghan politicians and the Taliban. Similarly, USA has been engaged in separate dialogue processes with the Afghan government as well as the Taliban. Now, the fact that both Russia as well as US are engaging in talks with Taliban highlights the fact that both these countries have now realized that a long-term peace solution to the Afghan problem can be found only by giving concessions to Taliban. For example, both US as well as Russia have not insisted that the Taliban has to give up violence. Similarly, US has decided to withdraw its troops without any clear-cut role for the Taliban in the future Afghanistan. Apart from that, Taliban has recently declared that it would not be accepting the present Afghanistan constitution. Now, all these things clearly highlight that both US as well as Russia has given concessions to Taliban in the reconciliation process. However, the main problem with the reconciliation process is that the present reconciliation process is not Afghan led and Afghan owned. And more importantly, both Russia as well as US have become dependent upon Pakistan for the reconciliation process due to Pakistan's influence over the Taliban leadership. So, this clearly highlights that India has been left out of the reconciliation process due to India's insistence of not engaging with the Taliban directly. So, since India has been left out of the reconciliation process, this particular article here highlights that the Indian intelligence agencies must have to engage in a covert and informal talks with the Taliban. Apart from that, the article also highlights that Indian government has to intensify the dialogue with the regional stakeholders such as US, China, Russia as well as Iran. Now doing this would enable India to deal with the Afghan problem in future. Apart from that, India would also be able to protect its own interest in the Indian subcontinent. So these are some of the important aspects which one must know with respect to this particular article. With this, let us now move to the next article. Now this particular article appears on page number 1. The title of the article is Unregulated Deposit Schemes to be Banned. This article shall be important from the perspective of GS Paper 2, Governance, under the subsection Government Policies and Interventions. Now presently, a large number of illegal deposit schemes have been running in the country, wherein these illegal deposit schemes have been duping investors across India. Now it is commonly observed that the worst victims of these illegal deposit schemes happen to be the poor and vulnerable sections of the Indian society who lose their hard-earned money. Hence, in order to address this particular problem, the Finance Minister Mr. Arun Jaitley had declared in his budget speech of 2016-17 that the Union government would come out with a comprehensive legislation in order to regulate the deposit schemes in India. Hence, in this particular regard, the Union Cabinet has now approved the amendments to the Banning of Unregulated Deposit Schemes Bill 2018. Hence, as part of this video analysis, let us understand certain salient features of this particular bill. Now, presently in India, all the deposit taking entities are required to be registered with different entities in India. For example, the deposit taking NBFCs are needed to be regulated by the RBI. Similarly, the mutual funds are needed to be regulated by the SEBI. On the other hand, the chit fund companies are regulated by the concerned state governments. Now, this particular bill provides that all the deposit schemes have to be compulsorily registered with any of these entities. Now, if any entity fails to get registered with the RBI or the SEBI or the concerned state government, then in such cases, such an entity would be declared as a illegal deposit taking entity. And such illegal deposit taking activities have now been declared as offences. Apart from that, this particular bill also covers for defaults in the regulated deposit schemes, which means that even if a regulated deposit scheme fails to repay back the money to the depositors, even in such cases, this particular bill provides for punishment to such entities. Hence, in order to avoid the running of unregulated deposit schemes as well as to avoid default in the regulated deposit schemes, this particular bill provides for a severe punishment and a heavy fine to act as a deterrent. It also provides for a grievance redressal mechanism for those depositors who fail to get money from the deposit taking entities. For example, it provides for a repayment of deposits by the unregulated deposit schemes. Further, it has also designated the courts to try offences under this particular act. And in order to ensure smooth implementation of the law, it provides for creation of an online centralized database of all the deposit taking activities in India. And the primary responsibility of the implementation of this particular act shall be vested with the state government. So these are some of the important aspects which one must know with respect to this particular article. With this, let us now move to the next article. Now the next article appears on page number 1. The title of the article is Panel Differs the Resort Project at Andamans. This particular article shall be important from the perspective of GS Paper 3, Environment, under the subsection Environmental Conservation. Last year, the Union Home Ministry had set up the Island Development Agency. Now, this particular agency had been made responsible for the development of infrastructure projects in Andaman and Nicobar Islands as well as Lakshadweep in order to promote tourism. And accordingly, the Andaman and Nicobar Integrated Development Corporation Limited had put forward a proposal for the construction of island resort in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. However, an expert committee under the Ministry of Environment and Forest was of the opinion that the construction of island resort in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands would threaten the unique biodiversity of this particular region, and accordingly the expert committee has deferred the permission for the construction of this particular project. Now, with respect to a prelims examination, one would be required to have a basic understanding related to the Island Development Agency. As we have discussed, the Island Development Agency has been set up in order to provide for a holistic and integrated development of islands in India. This particular agency works under the Union Home Ministry and it is headed by the Union Home Minister. Apart from that, important members of this particular agency include the Union Home Secretary, the Cabinet Secretary, the Secretaries of the Ministry of Environment and Forest, the Ministry of Tribal Affairs, as well as the Ministry of Tourism. So these are some of the important aspects which one must know with respect to this particular article. The next article appears on page number 7. This particular article here highlights that India's communication satellite GSAT-31 has recently been launched from French Guiana. Hence, this article becomes important from the perspective of prelims under the subsection General Science and Technology. From the perspective of prelims, let us understand certain basic details related to the GSAT-31. Now, the GSAT-31 is India's 40th communication satellite with a mission of 15 years, and it would provide coverage over India's mainland as well as islands. And the services that would be offered by GSAT-31 include the DTH services, cellular connectivity, connectivity to the ATMs, as well as the e-governance applications of the government. Now, these aspects of the article becomes important from the perspective of prelims. Now, based upon our discussion, these 4 questions shall be a prelims question for the practice. Please pause this video and try to find answers to these 4 questions. We will be discussing the answer after 5 seconds. The first question here is, consider the following statements related to the Pradhan Mantri Jan Arogya Abhiyan, which is a component of the Ayushman Bharat scheme. The first statement here is, this health insurance scheme provides free coverage of up to rupees 10 lakh per family per year. Now, this particular statement here is wrong. This is because it provides for a free insurance coverage of up to rupees 5 lakhs. The second statement here reads as, this scheme covers the insurance for the secondary and tertiary treatment. And as we have discussed, this statement here is correct. So looking at the options here, the correct answer to this question is B, that is 2 only. The second question here reads as, consider the following statements related to the National Health Protection Policy 2017. The first statement here is, it aims to increase the government's expenditure on health to 3%. Now, this particular statement here is wrong. This is because the National Health Protection Policy aims to increase the government's expenditure on health to 2.5% of its GDP. The second statement reads as, the policy advocates allocating major proportion of resources to the primary care followed by the secondary and tertiary care. Now, this particular statement here is right. So looking at the options here, the correct answer to this question is B, that is 2 only. The third question here is, consider the following statements related to the Island Development Agency. The first statement here is, it works under the Union Home Ministry. Now, this particular statement here is correct. The second statement reads as, it is headed by the Prime Minister. Now, this particular option here is wrong. This is because the Island Development Agency is headed by the Union Home Minister. So looking at the options here, the correct answer to this question is A, that is 1 only. The fourth question here is, with reference to Pradhan Mantri Shram Yogi Mandhan scheme, consider the following statements. The first statement here is, it would provide for a guaranteed pension of rupees 3,000 per month. Now, this particular statement here is correct. The second statement reads as, it would be applicable for all the workers in the unorganized sector. Now, this particular statement here is wrong. This is because this particular scheme would be applicable to only those workers whose monthly income is less than rupees 15,000. So looking at the options here, the correct answer to this question is A, that is 1 only. With this, we have come to end of today's discussion. Now let us look at the question for the day.